everybody. Welcome to today's debate. The topic of debate is there a God? Not focusing on any particular iteration of that God. Our debaters today are Jackson Misek, a current paid student and a Lewiston youth pastor. He will be debating the side that is for the existence of God, and Chris Ray, a former Bates student who graduated last year, a writer for the Teapot Atheist, who will be arguing that there is no God. The format of the debate is we'll start with 10-minute openers from each party, starting with Chris Ray, and this will follow with rebuttal from each debater, and then a Q&A session with members of the audience, and finally closing remarks from both debaters. And without further ado, I would like to pass the mantle to Chris.
Thank you, Carter. Thanks, guys. Thanks, everyone, for being here. Thanks, Mike and Jackson. So the question that's before us today is an ancient one, obviously, and one on which there is, much controversy. Clearly, we need debates like this for a reason. The disagreement exists. But actually, I think that this is a fairly settled question, this question of God's existence. But before I get into the reasons for that, I'd like to make a correction that I think is germane to the content of my argument, namely that I will not be taking the position that God does not exist. I think that is a futile endeavor. I don't think evidence can be adduced to that effect. What I will be arguing instead is that we do not have good reasons to believe that God exists, and that I think that that is sufficient to establish atheism as the dominant position over theism. But before I begin that analysis, I'd like to just talk about why I think this question is settled. I'm referring now to a study that was done in 2008, the only one of its kind of which I'm aware, of what the academic philosophers think about certain salient philosophical problems. They asked about major moral questions, basically big topics in philosophy. And one of the questions I took interest in was, does God exist, was the question. And a whopping 78% of professional academic philosophers report that they do not believe that God exists. And in fact, that made it far and away the most settled question on that survey. So within the realm of academic philosophy, the question is settled, I think. I think that getting a majority of that size is not going to happen elsewhere. But of course, this is not going to be resolved by popular opinion. People's votes don't determine the truth. But let's think about why that might be the case. Why is it that people whose job it is to study arguments would come out to think that the arguments have failed? Because I think that there are many, many arguments for God's existence that are intuitively very compelling. And that's what I'm going to begin with, is why are these arguments so intuitively compelling? These are arguments like, why do we exist? Why is there something other than nothing? Where did the universe come from? These are deep, probing questions. I do not know the answer to any of them, which is one of the reasons that I cannot say that there is no God, because I do not have answers to these questions. But the contention that I'm going to defend is that every argument for God's existence, of which I'm aware, with full exception, essentially depends on inferring from this I don't know response to where did the universe come from, how did life arise on Earth. The inference from I don't know the answer to an all-powerful, all-knowing, perfectly good, perfectly free, self-sustaining, self-explaining creator of the universe is a very wide leap, one that no argument can be successful in establishing. With the full exception of the ontological argument, but that's a class of its own, as I said. So really, these arguments for God's existence are failures on the theme. Let's say that we had concrete, absolute evidence, proof even, that the Big Bang was the first moment, the first thing in time ever, and that it arose out of nothing, and that there was nothing prior to it. For example, this argument, for example, then we would say, I do not know why there was a Big Bang. I do not know what issued forth from it exists. But show me the logical leap, and I invite Jackson to go into more detail on this one during his speech. What is the transition there from our not knowing the answer to our having an answer, which is God? And this brings me to what I think is the foundational premise of epistemology in general and of forming beliefs. This is the principle of parsimony, better known as Occam's razor. Basically, this principle which says that when we are presented with two possible options, does God exist, or God exists, God does not exist, that the position that relies on the fewest unjustified assumptions is more likely to be true, and is the one that we should probably go with, just because with fewer assumptions, fewer things can go wrong. And I think that this might seem unfair. Oh, your position is the default position. How convenient. But this is actually the way that we form beliefs all the time. if I asserted, for example, the existence of a man in this room who is invisible, who is not amenable to empiricism, who seems to not interact with the world in any way, but perhaps created it, I could never disprove the existence of that man. I could never show you an argument that would refute his existence. But I still would not believe in it. I would be an agnostic on his existence, in the way that I would not have knowledge that he did or did not exist. But I would also be an atheist on his existence, simply because I lack the belief. I lack the affirmative belief in that person. And I think that unless Jackson's arguments are successful in his opening speech, I think that we should simply take atheism as the default position. And barring some incredibly creative reinvention in natural theology, which so far has failed to produce any argument that has compelled the majority of philosophers, for example, certainly, barring that, I think that the question is settled in that way. But this, of course, is unsatisfying. I can't just tell you that there is no God, any questions. So I think I'm going to turn now to what's the only real weapon in the atheist arsenal against God's existence, the only affirmative argument we ever make. This is the problem of evil, as it's called in philosophical literature. And this begins with the notion that God, as he is conceived, the God to which we are referring today, is construed as a perfectly good and all-powerful being who also created ourselves and the cosmos that we inhabit. And it seems to me that these three things together, his might, his goodness, and our existence, and his having created us, four things, are not compatible, because we see in our universe, I think, strong evidence of gross incompetence on the part of the Creator, or perhaps evidence that the Creator is a sociopath of some kind. If we construe the universe as intelligently designed, because we live in a world that is basically a killing machine, that our universe will grind us all into dust the first chance that it gets. It does not care about you. It does not like you. Just a few days ago, we saw tornadoes in the South, in the most religious part of the United States, just indiscriminately sweep away men, women, children, young, old, guilty, not guilty, good, bad, everyone, just brushed aside. Now, it seems to me that if we treat the existence of God as a hypothesis, like a scientific hypothesis, as I believe that we must, then we have to think about what's the evidentiary burden for that hypothesis, and to what side of that hypothesis does the evidence given to us by nature and by its destructive tendencies offer to us. So if we were going to say that somebody is a very, very good, let's say, carpenter, would we accept as evidence of his being the master carpenter, his being the perfect carpenter, a broken table, or a table that things can't rest on? No, that on any ordinary common sense understanding of good carpenter, we should expect good carpentry. Likewise, if we construe the creator of the universe as an artificer who made this thing, then we should expect something better than what we've got. Something better than, where we inhabit a universe that is 99.999+% uninhabitable, radiation-desiccated vacuum that will kill you the moment you step into it. Our own planet, mostly uninhabitable, 2/3 salt water, toxic to humans. Most parts too hot, too cold, ice caps, mountains, desert. And what little we have left, we have been left to struggle for and to fight for amongst ourselves, because God saw fit to imbue in us things like a hunger for resources, an instinct to expand. That the processes, whether or not Jackson's going to assert evolution as the process behind that God used evolution as the process, or if God created us, either way the end result is, I still think, a highly defective product, which leaves us with the hypothesis of God, I think, having strong evidence against it. But as I've written elsewhere, I do not think that the problem of evil is a refutation of God's existence. I think that it's an evidentiary matter. I suspect it's the evidentiary problem of evil, because certainly there can be scenarios in which God decided deliberately to create a universe together. Perhaps God just doesn't like humans. I mean, perhaps God likes black holes. I've referred to the work of Victor Stenger, who has produced amazing physical studies showing that the fundamental laws of our universe, the basic premises, what's the cosmological constant, gravitational constant, things like that, they all sort of conglomerate on showing that this universe is optimized for black holes. Perhaps God likes black holes a whole lot. I don't know. Jackson may argue that. I doubt he will, but it's possible. But for humans, a God who cares about us, a God whose interests include our own interests, highly unlikely on this hypothesis. But even barring the success of that argument, I think that even if we have an absence of an evidentiary problem for theism, the evidentiary problem for theism is more basic. Evidence in general. The arguments fail, the belief fails. And I think that, as history has shown, as we will probably get to in the rebuttals, the arguments have failed. And because of their failure, atheism, the default position, must triumph. And with that, I yield to Mr. Nesbitt. Thank you.